This was the year I almost left, so I am going to write down, right here, every single reason I am choosing to stay, because I never, ever want to forget that I chose her. That was the first line of the first letter. My husband Dan wrote those words 15 years ago, sealed them, and locked them in a bank box he never told me existed. I read them for the first time a few months ago, sitting alone at a small steel table in a bank vault, a widow finally being handed the answer to a question she had been afraid to ask out loud for 15 years. My name is Dana Whitfield. I am 42 years old, and I work as an interior designer in Sacramento, California. I spend my days helping people make a house feel like it was always meant to be theirs, which is its own quiet irony, given how long I spent unsure whether my own husband had truly meant to stay in ours. Dan and I were married for 21 years. He died a little over a year ago. I am going to tell you what was in that safe deposit box. But first you have to understand the year that first letter was written, the year our marriage nearly did not survive. Dan and I married young. I was 21, he was 23, and we did what young people do. We built a life fast, before we really knew what we were building. Children came, and a mortgage, and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of it. And for the first stretch, it was good. And then, around our 6th or 7th year, it was not. I am not going to dramatize it, because the truth is, it was not dramatic. And that was almost the frightening part. There was no single catastrophe. There was just a slow, cold drift. We had married so young that we had grown, separately, into people who were not sure they recognized each other. The warmth thinned out. The conversations got shorter. We were tired, and we were disappointed, and we were not unkind exactly, but we had become two people sharing a house and a calendar and very little else. There was a year in there, I can still feel the shape of it, where I genuinely did not know if our marriage was going to last, where I think we both, privately, considered the other door. I want to be honest about what that year actually felt like, day to day, because it was not screaming and it was not slam doors. It was quieter and lonelier than that. It was sitting across a dinner table from the person you had promised your whole life to and reaching for something to say and finding nothing. It was lying in the same bed with a careful strip of cold space down the middle of it. It was being more alone inside my marriage than I had ever been before I had one. We were polite. We were functional. We co-parented, and we paid the bills, and we said good morning. And underneath all of that ordinary functioning, something essential had simply gone quiet, and neither of us knew how to say so, and so neither of us did. That, I have learned, is how most marriages actually come close to ending, not with a bang, with a long, courteous silence that nobody is brave enough to break. We did not take that door. We stayed. Somehow, without any grand conversation, we stayed, and slowly the cold year passed, and the warmth came back in pieces, and we went on to have 14 more years that were, by any honest measure, good ones. But here's the thing this whole story turns on. We never talked about that year. Not ever. We came out the other side of it, and we simply, by silent agreement, sealed it shut and never opened it again. And because we never opened it, I never got the one thing I quietly needed from it. I need to tell you about the doubt, because the doubt is what I carried for the next 15 years. Here is what I never said to anyone. After that cold year, even through all the good years that followed, a small question lived in me, and it never fully went away. The question was, why did Dan stay? Did my husband stay because he had looked at our struggling marriage and actively, truly chosen me? Or did he stay simply because leaving is enormously hard? Because there were children and a house and 100 tangled threads? Because inertia is powerful and staying was just the path of least resistance? I did not know. We had never spoken the words. And so, for 15 years, underneath a perfectly happy-looking life, I carried a quiet uncertainty about whether I was, in the deepest sense, wanted, or merely kept. Whether my husband was beside me by decision or just by default. I never asked him. I was afraid of the answer. And then he died, and I thought the question had died with him. Unanswerable, sealed forever, the way that cold year had always been sealed. I did not know he had written the answer down. I did not know it was in a bank. I want to tell you how that doubt actually behaved over 15 years, because it was not loud, and it was not constant, and that is exactly what made it so durable. It did not ruin my days, it just visited them. It would surface on an anniversary while I watched Dan across a restaurant table and wondered, privately, whether he was glad to be there or simply used to it. It would surface in the small hours of a bad night. It would surface, strangely, in the good moments most of all. A warm, ordinary Sunday, the whole family in one room, and a thin voice in me asking, "But does he want this? Or has he only stayed near it?" I never let the doubt speak above a whisper. But a whisper, kept up for 15 years, wears a groove. And I had simply come to accept that groove as a permanent feature of my own heart. A small, unanswered question I would carry, I assumed, into my own grave. Dan died suddenly. It was an illness, and it was fast, and a little over a year ago I became, at 41, a widow with 2 teenagers and a house full of a man's unfinished life to sort through. The word unfinished is the one that matters. When a death is slow, there is at least time. Time for the saying of things, the settling of things, the long goodbyes. Dan's death gave us none of that. One season he was a healthy man in his 40s, and a few months later he was gone, and everything that had been mid-sentence in his life simply stopped mid-sentence. And I think that is part of why his secret box undid me the way it did. He had not chosen to leave those letters as a final message. He had not been given the chance to choose anything. The box was not a goodbye he composed. It was simply where his love happened to be when time ran out on him. And so I came to it, not as a gift handed over, but as a thing interrupted. A sentence he never got to finish speaking aloud. Sorting through a dead spouse's papers is its own particular grief, and I will not dwell on it. But several weeks into it, going through a file of financial documents, I found 2 things that did not fit. The first was a small flat key, taped to an index card, of a kind I did not recognize. The second was a statement from a bank, not our bank, a different one, for a safe deposit box. A safe deposit box. Dan and I had been married for 21 years. We had shared every account, every password, every financial decision. That is what made the discovery feel so strange in my hands. Ours had not been a marriage of separate lives and private corners. We were, if anything, almost too entwined, 2 people who knew the contents of each other's days. I could have told you the balance of every account we held, and so a bank Dan used alone, and a box he had paid for quietly, year after year, without one word. It did not fit the man I thought I had been married to. It felt, holding that statement, like discovering a locked room in a house I had lived in for 2 decades and believed I knew completely. And here, in his handwriting, was a bank he had never mentioned and a locked box I had never known existed. My first feeling, I will be honest, was not curiosity. It was fear, because a secret box, kept by a husband I had spent 15 years quietly unsure of, could hold anything. It could hold the kind of answer I had spent 15 years not asking for. I sat with that key in my hand for a long time at the kitchen table, and I noticed something about my own fear that shamed me a little. Part of me genuinely did not want to open that box, and not because I thought it held something criminal or sordid. I never truly believed that of Dan. I did not want to open it because as long as it stayed closed, my 15-year-old question stayed officially unanswered. And an unanswered question, however heavy, at least leaves room for hope. Opening the box meant a verdict. It meant finding out, finally and for certain, whether the man I had buried had wanted me or merely tolerated me. And after 15 years of not knowing, the prospect of knowing was genuinely terrifying. It is a strange thing to admit, but I think a lot of us protect our doubts, in the end, because the doubt feels safer than a verdict could. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage, and the paperwork, to go. The paperwork itself was its own small ordeal. A death certificate, proof I was the executor, a notarized form, the slow, careful machinery a bank wraps around a box belonging to someone who has died. And every step of it gave my fear another day to work. By the time the appointment finally came, I had imagined the contents of that box 100 different ways. I had imagined documents about another woman. I had imagined evidence of some private financial trouble he had carried alone. I had imagined, in my lowest moments, some plain proof that the marriage had been, on his side, exactly the dutiful arrangement I had feared. I had imagined nearly everything across those 2 weeks. The one thing I had not let myself imagine, the one possibility my 15-year-old doubt would not permit, was that the box might hold proof that I had been loved. But eventually, I sat down with a bank employee, and I was led back into the vault, and the box was brought out and set on a small steel table, and I was left alone with it. And I opened my husband's secret. There was no money. There were no documents, no hidden accounts, nothing financial at all. The box was full of envelopes. Plain white envelopes, a stack of them, perhaps 20, and every single one had the same word written on the front in Dan's handwriting. The word was my name, Dana. 20-some envelopes, each one addressed simply to Dana, arranged in order, the paper of the bottom ones gone slightly soft with age. I sat at that steel table in that silent vault, and I lifted out the oldest one, the one at the bottom, and I saw the date he had written in the corner. And the date stopped my breath. Because it was from 15 years ago. It was from the cold year. The year our marriage almost ended was the year my husband had started to write. I want you to understand what that date did to me, sitting alone in that vault. For 15 years I had thought of the cold year as the low point of our marriage. The year of the strip of cold bed, the year of nothing to say, the year we both eyed the other door. It was the year I had built my whole quiet doubt around. And here, in my hands, was proof that the cold year had been something else entirely from Dan's side of it. While I had been experiencing that year as the beginning of the end, my husband had been experiencing it as the beginning of a decision. The very same 12 months. We had lived them in the same house, and one of us had been quietly grieving the marriage, while the other was quietly, deliberately, recommitting to it. And neither of us had said a word, so neither of us had known. I sat at that steel table, holding an envelope, and understood that I had misread the single most important year of my marriage for a decade and a half. I opened the oldest letter first, there in the vault, and that is the letter that began, "This was the year I almost left, so I am going to write down every reason I am choosing to stay." And then Dan, 15 years younger, a man in the middle of a marriage he was not sure of, did exactly that. He wrote me a letter, never sent, never given, that was a list. A careful, honest, unsentimental list of the reasons he was choosing to stay married to me. And I want to be clear about how the letter sounded, because it was not a love letter in the soft sense. It was better than that. It was a man being truthful with himself in the hardest year. There were no flowery phrases in it, no borrowed poetry, none of the language of greeting cards. If anything, the letter was almost plain. The writing of an ordinary man, in an ordinary hand, working something out. And that plainness is exactly why it landed the way it did. A soft, sentimental love letter, written easily on a happy day, would have proven very little. Anyone can be tender when things are good. But this was tenderness produced under load. A man choosing me on the page in the precise year he had the most reason not to. It was not the love letter of a husband who felt swept away. It was the love letter of a husband who had every reason to leave, and sat down and reasoned his way, honestly and without illusion, back to me. I had spent 15 years secretly wishing for proof of grand passion. What Dan had left me was something I came to understand was far more valuable. Proof of grand decision. He wrote about how difficult that year had been. He did not pretend. He wrote that leaving had felt, some days, like the easier and more honest thing. And then he wrote, line by line, why he was not going to. He wrote about the specific way I laughed. He wrote about who I was when our children were sick. He wrote about a version of our future he could still see and did not want to lose. He wrote, near the end, I think a marriage is not one promise. I think it is a promise you have to make again. So I am making it again this year, on purpose. I am choosing her. I just need to write it down so it counts. I have read a great many words in my life, but I am not sure any of them have ever rearranged me the way that paragraph did. Because for 15 years, my doubt had been built on a hidden assumption. The assumption that love, in a marriage, is something that either survives a hard year or does not, passively, the way a plant survives a winter or dies. And Dan, 15 years younger, sitting somewhere alone with a pen, had quietly understood something I had not. He had understood that love in a long marriage is not whether you wait out. It is a decision you make. He had looked at our coldest year and refused to simply wait and see whether the warmth came back on its own. Instead, he had chosen, deliberately, with effort, and then, because he did not trust a feeling to hold, he had written the choice down so that it would count, so that it would be a fact and not a mood. I sat in that vault and realized my husband had known how to be married in a way I was only learning from him 15 years too late. And then I understood what the other 20 envelopes were, and I sat in that vault and I began, with shaking hands, to open them in order. He had done it every year. From that cold year onward, every single year, around the time of our anniversary, my husband had sat down somewhere private and written me a letter, and then sealed it and added it to the box. 20-some letters. 20-some years of a private, secret, annual ritual that I had lived right beside and never known about. And reading them in order, that afternoon and for many afternoons after, I watched our entire marriage unfold from the inside of the one person whose inside I had spent 15 years unsure of. I could not read them all in the vault, of course. I sat at that steel table and read perhaps the first 6 or 7, until a quiet man in a bank uniform gently let me know my time was ending, and I gathered the whole stack into my bag with shaking hands and carried 20 years of my husband home. And then I rationed them. I gave myself 1 letter an evening after the house had gone quiet, because I understood, after the first few, what I was actually holding. It was not a stack of mail. It was the last conversation I would ever get to have with Dan, and once I had read the final envelope, there would be no more of his words, ever. So I made it last. 1 letter a night, 1 year of our marriage at a time, my husband walking me slowly back through 2 decades and explaining, at last, what he had been feeling the whole way. The early letters, just after the cold year, were still working, still a man talking himself toward us, still effortful. And then, year by year, I watched them change. I watched the effort turn back into ease. I watched my husband fall, slowly and visibly, back in love with me across a decade of envelopes. There were letters about specific days I had completely forgotten, and he had not. There were letters that worried about me, that were proud of me, that noticed things about me I had never once suspected he saw. Every year, on purpose, my husband had taken stock of our marriage and chosen it again, and written down why, and locked the why in a vault. The question I had carried for 15 years, did he stay by decision or by default, was answered, completely and overwhelmingly, in his own handwriting, 20 times over. He had not stayed by default. He had chosen me, deliberately, on the record, every single year, including and especially the years I had been most afraid he was only drifting. There was 1 letter, from somewhere in the middle of the stack, that I have gone back to more than any other. It was not from a dramatic year, it was from an ordinary one, a year I could barely distinguish from the others. And in it, Dan wrote something like, "Nothing big happened this year, and I think that is exactly why I want to write it down. Anyone can choose the person in the big years. I want it on the record that I chose her in a year where nothing happened at all, a plain, tired, ordinary year, and I would not have traded 1 quiet evening of it." I sat with that for a long time, because the plain, tired, ordinary years were precisely the ones my doubt had always whispered through, the years I had been most certain we were merely coasting. And here was Dan telling me, from a sealed envelope, that the ordinary years had not been coasting at all. They had been chosen too. He had simply chosen them so quietly that I, living right beside him, had mistaken the quiet for indifference. I want to tell you what those letters did to 15 years of quiet doubt, because it was not a small thing. It rewrote my whole marriage. For 15 years, I had walked through my own marriage with a faint, permanent question mark hovering over it, a low, background uncertainty about whether I was truly wanted. And the letters did not just answer the question, they revealed that I had been asking it from inside a marriage that was, the entire time, the exact opposite of what I feared. I had thought our silence about the cold year meant we had simply survived it and moved on, indifferent. The letters showed me that Dan had not been silent about that year at all. He had been processing it, every anniversary, deliberately and lovingly, in a private place. The man I had quietly suspected of staying out of inertia had been the most intentional husband imaginable. He had just done his choosing where I could not see it. And I had to grieve, reading those envelopes, two separate things. I had to grieve Dan all over again. And I had to grieve the 15 years I had spent half-doubting a love that, it turned out, had been documented and dated and locked in a vault the whole time. The grief over the wasted doubt was, in some ways, the sharper of the two. Grieving Dan was clean. It was simply love with nowhere left to go, but grieving the 15 years was complicated because it had a thread of self-reproach running through it. I kept thinking, every anniversary dinner where I had quietly wondered if he wanted to be there, he had wanted to be there so much that he was going to go home and write about it. Every small hour's night I had lain awake doubting, the answer had been sitting in a vault across town, dated and signed. I had owned a marriage that was, by the evidence, extraordinary, and I had spent a decade and a half of it living slightly braced, slightly unsure, slightly holding back because of a question I never had the courage to ask aloud. The letters gave me my husband's love in full, but they also showed me, with terrible clarity, exactly how much of that love I had failed to feel while I still had him, simply because I had decided to wonder in silence instead of ask. The question that haunted me, of course, was why? Why, if he wrote me a letter every year, did he never once give me a single one? Why a vault? Why let me carry the doubt when the cure was sitting in a bank across town? I have thought about this more than anything else, and I believe I understand it, because it is the most human failing there is. I do not think Dan was hiding the letters from me exactly. I think he was saving them. I think, somewhere in his mind, there was a someday, a 40th anniversary, a perfect quiet evening, a milestone, when he would finally bring the whole box home and put it in my hands and watch my face as I understood. The letters were a gift he was assembling, and he was waiting for the right moment to give it. And the lesson sitting inside that, the hard one, is this: he ran out of moments. The someday he was saving them for simply never arrived, because he died first, the way we never believe we will. He had a profound, decades-long, beautifully documented love for me, and he kept it in a box, waiting for a perfect occasion. And the occasion never came, and so I received 20 years of my husband's devotion all at once, from a stranger at a bank, a year after he was gone. And I have had to forgive him for that, quietly and completely. There were a few early days, I will admit, when something close to anger flickered in me. How could you let me carry the doubt, Dan, when the answer was an hour's drive away? How could you have everything I needed sealed in a box and never simply hand it to me? But the anger never lasted, because I knew the man, and I knew it was never withholding. It was the opposite of withholding. It was a person who loved me so much that he wanted the giving of it to be perfect, a grand and worthy moment, not an ordinary Tuesday. He made the same mistake with his love that I made with my doubt. He kept it private, waiting for the right time to bring it into the open, and the right time ran out. We were, in the end, two people who both stayed silent about the most important thing, each for our own reason. The only difference is that his silence was a gift he was saving, and mine was a question I was avoiding. But silence is silence. It cost us both. A year has passed now since the vault. I have read all the letters many times. They live in a wooden box on my dresser now, out of the bank, home at last where they always should have been. And they have changed me in a way I did not expect. I am not only comforted by them, I am instructed by them. Because Dan taught me something, 20 envelopes deep, that I had been married for 21 years and never fully understood. He taught me that a marriage is not a single decision you make in a church when you are 21. It is a decision you remake, quietly, deliberately, every year, for as long as it lasts. The vows are not the choosing. The vows are just the first time. The real marriage is the 1,000 small re-choosings after, the ones nobody sees. I had spent 15 years afraid that Dan had stopped choosing me after that cold year. The truth was that the cold year was when he started choosing me on purpose, and never once stopped. I showed the letters to our 2 children. I wanted them to have it. Not the doubt, never the doubt, but the answer. I wanted them to grow up knowing what their parents' marriage had actually been, underneath the ordinary surface of it. Not a thing that merely lasted, but a thing that was chosen, and chosen, and chosen again. That is the inheritance Dan left them, locked in a bank without their knowing. The knowledge of what real, lasting love actually looks like from the inside. It does not look like a perfect, unbroken feeling. It looks like a man in a hard year, sitting down with a pen, deciding on purpose, and writing it down so it counts. My daughter said something, when she had read enough of them, that I will keep for the rest of my life. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Mom, I think Dad was the bravest in the year that looks the saddest." And she was right, and it took a 17-year-old to say it plainly. The cold year, the year I had spent 15 years treating as the wound at the center of my marriage, my daughter looked at the evidence and correctly identified it as the bravest year of her father's life. The year he could most easily have left and chose, on paper, with effort, to stay, and then quietly built the next 2 decades on that single hard decision. I had been mourning that year for 15 years. My children get to be proud of it instead. That is what the box did. It did not just answer my question, it turned the lowest chapter of our family story into the one we are proudest of. I want to leave you with the 2 things this taught me. The first is about the doubts so many of us carry silently inside our closest relationships. For 15 years, I lived beside a question I never asked. Am I truly wanted or merely kept? And I let it quietly shadow an entire marriage because I was more afraid of the answer than I was tired of the doubt. And the letters taught me how badly I had bet. The answer, when it finally came, was not the thing I feared. It was the opposite, and it had been available, in a sense, the whole time. I had only needed to ask. So, if there is a question like that living in you, about a spouse, a parent, a friend, some quiet uncertainty about whether you are truly loved, I am asking you not to do what I did. Do not carry it silently for 15 years. Ask. Say it out loud, to the person, while they are here to answer. The truth is so often kinder than the doubt, and you do not want to receive it, as I did too late, from a box. The second thing is about the love we save for later. Dan wrote down his love for me, fully and beautifully, 20 times, and then he saved it, kept it sealed for a perfect someday, and the someday never came. And I think a great many of us do a smaller version of this every day. We feel the love, and we plan to express it properly later, at the right moment, on the right occasion, when things are calmer. But later is not a promise anyone can keep, so do not save it. If you have written the letter, give the letter. If you feel the thing, say the thing, today, plainly, in whatever imperfect moment you actually have. Do not lock your love in a vault and wait for an occasion worthy of it. The occasion is now. It was always now. If this story landed for you, drop the word "chosen" in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, the doubt you carry in silence is almost always worse than the truth you are afraid to ask for. I spent 15 years quietly unsure whether my husband truly wanted me and never once asked, because I feared the answer more than I minded the doubt. When the answer finally came, it was the opposite of my fear, and it had been there to be found the whole time. If a quiet question is shadowing one of your closest relationships, do not let it live in you for years unspoken. Ask it, out loud, of the person while they can still answer. The truth is usually kinder than the silence, and you do not want to learn it too late. Second, do not save your love for a someday that is not promised. It is easy to feel love fully and still postpone expressing it properly, to wait for the right moment, the right anniversary, the calmer season. But later is not guaranteed to anyone. If you have written the letter, deliver it. If you feel the thing, say it now, in whatever ordinary, imperfect moment you actually have. Love locked away for a worthier occasion can end up arriving too late, or never. The occasion you are waiting for is already here. Give them the letter while they can still read it. I'll see you next time.